One of the reasons why anybody does an MBA or does any further executive education is because you want to make lots of money in the long term. And for many people who are studying at an academic institution like GIBS, one of the things you're going to need when you leave a place like this is cash. So who do you ask? Well, you could call Ghostbusters. They're not going to help much. South African Venture Capital and Private Equity Association, however, may be able to help. It's got a new chief executive. Her name is Erika. And it used to be Venture Capital Association only, but you put private equity into it, Erika. That makes it pretty big and gives you lots of cash to spend.
Well, that's all about the name, but private equity has always been in there. And if you look at the whole asset class, private equity dominates this alternative asset class, which includes venture capital at one end of the continuum, which is a smaller end. It's probably about 1% of total assets under management, all the way through to private equity in its intermediate and advanced stages.
Why is it so hard for anybody with a brilliant idea to get money?
Well, I think that's the nature of entrepreneurism, capitalism. It's about that story, your wonderful, brilliant idea. It has to be tested, and capital is scarce and capital is expensive. So before the investor commits his capital, he or she needs to be sure that this is indeed a good story.
Are there enough opportunities for venture capitalists, for the guys in the private equity space, to invest in South Africa?
Well, there are two questions, and then if I could just focus on the venture capital, which is the initial part, I think there are many opportunities, and probably I think the venture capital investors are overwhelmed by the daily applications and the stories, the pitches that they get. You should speak to them. It's really quite exciting what they see, and funny too, I think, in many instances. I think the big constraint on the VC side, the venture capital side, is access to capital. So I think the momentum that you're seeing in South Africa, increasingly, it's getting the angel investors together. This is very far advanced in markets like the US, for instance, where that's understood. There's a culture of that. Here, we've got a few rich individuals quietly doing it under the radar. We may not know about it, but I think that is the future for venture capital, getting those angel investors together and also convincing institutional investors, really making them comfortable with this asset class.
That's really important. There's, Section Regulation 28, which allows pension funds to invest 10% of their assets in these alternative investments, but they just don't do it. Is that a failing of the private equity venture capital industry, that it hasn't perhaps made it exciting enough or communicated it clearly enough?
Well, I think it's been a huge success for the private equity and venture capital space to have seen through this new legislation, this new concession that pension funds can allocate up to 10% into private equity. It's been about a year, so one understands that it will take pension funds and their trustees some time to develop some familiarity with the asset class and indeed to allocate funds there. We're not seeing it yet, but we're fairly confident that in the months and years to come that will indeed happen. And with the Government Employee Pension Fund, the largest pension fund in Africa, committing up to 10% of its assets to private equity, I think there's a very strong demonstration effect that will come from there.
Does that bring private equity and venture capital from under the radar? You mentioned it's under the radar. Does it bring it from under the radar? Does it make it more public? Does it suddenly make it more accessible?
I think so. And I think the Government Employee Pension Fund has been very vocal in their support for the asset class. They see the superior returns. If you look at the track record, private equity consistently outperforming listed equity. They see the potential that this asset class has, for instance, in transformation, in empowerment, and also environmental, social and governance effects that this asset class has, simply because of the way it's constructed, with the fund managers being directly involved in the underlying company, having a far greater say in the business. So I think with their support for the industry, I think it will ensure broader support and understanding for private equity.
Will it make it easier for the current crop of MBA students and for future MBA students to access capital than perhaps MBA students of a decade ago?
That's an interesting point, because I think perhaps the source of capital for private equity might be changing, and I think perhaps broadening, and maybe the model in time will change. And I think if there is a greater awareness of private equity, if we can tap more successfully into the local pension funds, we have already, but just to deepen that access, that means, yes, more capital comes to the table, more support for those with their big ideas, whether it's on the VC side and the smaller side to medium and large size businesses.
Why are venture capitalists by their nature so blimmin' secretive? Why aren't they out there and proud? They're a bit like philanthropists generally, up until recently with Patrice Motsepe, who's come out and nailed his colours to the mast, so to speak. Why aren't venture capitalists a bit more Patrice-ish in their approach and in sharing the fact that, look, we have money for good ideas? Do too many people waste their time?
So I suppose maybe they feel they don't need to be out there, they don't need to be public, they're just quietly getting on with their work. And I think there have been lots of novels written and books made depicting it as some sort of out there industry. But in fact, these are very serious, skilled individuals who are just quietly getting on with finding those target companies, and they don't want to trigger an auction process and push up the price. So they're just quietly looking for those wonderful deals that they do eventually find and bringing about transformation.
Erika van der Merwe, Chief Executive of the South African Venture Capital Association, add in private equity into that as well. If you're looking for money, go to her. She'll direct you. Erika van der Merwe, Chief Executive of SAVCA, thank you.
Thanks, Bruce.